I think today's student of public policy has to master a whole array of different skills, skills in presentation, skills in policy analysis, skills in the use of technology and the impact of technology. People demand a voice in public policy in a way they never have before, and finding ways to incorporate that voice is an immense challenge. The sort of top-down solutions that we've seen for centuries really are no longer viable in a world where everyone has a smartphone, everyone has access to information, everyone can check things on the internet. So we're dealing with a much more transparent world. We're dealing with a world where there's much greater levels of accountability, where almost anything you say in a public meeting can be recorded and distributed around the world immediately. There are a lot more challenges just broadly in public policies. One thing that I like to do, because I teach on conflict, is to get people to examine the impact conflict has had on their own families and their own lives. And if one looks back at, fortunately for most of us in Europe, our grandparents, you'll see that many of them, were impacted very dramatically by conflict. I think it's very important to anchor these things in one's own family and one's own experience, and to remember that many of our families, many of our forebears have been victims of conflict, whose lives have been enormously disrupted by conflict, whose whole family histories have been shaped by it. I think it's very important to have that kind of personal understanding so that you recognize that in the world of public policy we're dealing with very real people living very real lives that are often in turmoil, and it's very important to anchor one's ideas and policy development in that idea of real people. I like to make sure that there's as much student engagement in the conversation as possible. Sometimes there's a reticence on the part of students to talk about issues that they may not be fully familiar with, that they're still learning about. But I still think it's good to push people, to challenge them to speak up, partially because these are skills you need to develop anyway for whatever you do in life. It's important to be able to make an effective presentation, to make your case, to argue a certain point. So I think it's very important to get students to speak up, even if it has to be done by sort of allocating them a point of view and saying, you need to argue this side of the argument and you'll argue that side of the argument. Well, I've worked for the past 12 years on conflict, mostly in Asia, and that's covered a very wide array of countries, more than 20 different countries across Asia, and a great many different issues. So I've focused on a whole number of things, from constitutional development, post-conflict reconstruction in countries like Afghanistan, reconciliation efforts in places like Timor-Leste, in Indonesia, elsewhere, some issues of proliferation, particularly North Korea, and its nuclear weapons programs and its missile programs. What I focused on substantially was directing field research programs. So what I focus on in terms of research is actually getting into the countries in conflict, finding out what the actors in those conflicts are thinking, what they're looking for, why they're fighting, why they might be engaged in violence. So that's been sort of principal areas of research, but it's been a fairly broad base.